I remember sitting at my desk late one night, staring at a grant application for an art project I deeply believed in. I had spent days describing the aesthetic vision, the emotional nuance, the sheer beauty of the work. Then I checked the Foundation's updated guidelines and realized I had to delete almost all of it. In the span of an hour, I didn't change a single thing about the actual art, but on paper, I completely transformed it. A play about human complexity became a tool for social cohesion. A visual exploration of loneliness was rewritten as a strategy to improve community mental health outcomes. I found myself fluidly translating passion into policy speak, promising deliverables and economic impact. It felt like a distinct kind of performance art. I was participating in this strange, silent dance where the art itself, the thing we were actually doing, was treated like window dressing for a sociological experiment. It wasn't about whether the work was good, it was about what the work could fix. That moment of bureaucratic friction revealed a massive, uncomfortable truth we usually try to ignore. We like to pretend that art occupies a protected space, safe from the demands of utility and efficiency. But if you look at how we actually fund, build, and talk about culture today, that fantasy collapses. We have turned art into a Swiss Army knife expected to solve everything from urban decay to GDP growth. And in doing so, we might be forgetting why we needed it in the first place.
That experience, that just perfectly captures the central tension of modern cultural policy, doesn't it?
It really does.
We were watching this shift from valuing art intrinsically, for its beauty, its complexity, to justifying it almost entirely based on measurable extrinsic utility.
It has to prove its worth.
It has to earn its keep. It has to demonstrate it can boost economic prosperity or deliver very specific social outcomes like mental health improvement or urban renewal.
And that's really the mission of this deep dive today. We want to understand how these policy and funding frameworks around the world now actively demand that art be functional, that it be quantifiable and socially corrective.
We're exploring the mechanisms of this modern instrumentalization.
Right. And I think to start, we have to address the history of this. We need to confront a pretty uncomfortable reality, which is that the idea of pure art, untouched by any external motives, that's largely a modern invention.
Oh, absolutely. Art was arguably always instrumental.
I agree. The romance of the totally autonomous artist starving in a garret, making work purely for themselves, that's a pretty recent idea, maybe post-romanticism. If you look back through history, the function was always right there on the surface. Often it was grandly political or theological.
Precisely. If we go back to, say, Renaissance Italy, you look at the Medici family in 15th century Florence, they didn't just casually support artists because they enjoyed pretty things.
No.
They used these vast cultural projects, explicitly, to consolidate and project their power, to establish their legacy, and, to smooth over some of their less savory political dealings. It was a very sophisticated form of PR, decades before public relations was even a concept.
And the mechanism was so clear. They were the patrons. The artists were, in a sense, the employees. And the final painting or sculpture was a visible symbol of that authority.
It wasn't just about making beautiful paintings. It was about shaping the public's entire perception of the ruling class.
Or you can look even further back to ancient Rome.
Of course. Maecenas, right. His name is now literally synonymous with cultural patronage. But he didn't fund poets like Virgil and Horace just because he liked verse. He funded them because their work, especially Virgil's epic poetry, reinforced the values and the historical narratives that were necessary to legitimize the entire Augustan regime.
So the art was serving a direct ideological function for the state.
100%. And even religious art, which we might now look at as purely devotional, had this incredibly clear function. Medieval cathedrals were these overwhelming multimedia experiences.
Right, the architecture, the stained glass, the sculpture.
All of it. It all served as an explicit, massive theological argument designed to teach doctrine to a populace that was largely illiterate.
And I suppose there's no clearer example of that marriage between art and political power than in the Vatican.
The Sistine Chapel ceiling, commissioned by Pope Julius II. It was so much more than a devotional space. It was a grand, undeniable statement of papal power and authority at a time when the papacy was under immense political pressure.
It was an epic declaration.
It was. A declaration that the Pope held both the spiritual and the temporal keys to the universe.
Okay, so if art was always a tool, if its function was always baked into its creation, what truly defines this modern shift we're talking about? What's different now?
The shift is in the pretense. and the mechanism.
The pretense.
Yeah, the pretense of it all. Historically, the deal was visible. It was upfront. It was focused on high-level power projection. The patron received glory or spiritual absolution, and the artist received resources. Simple.
I know.
Today, the fiction is that we value intrinsic cultural merit above all else. But the mechanism of funding, the bureaucracy, requires that value to be translated into these measurable spreadsheet-friendly metrics that are focused on small-scale social fixes.
So we've moved from grand propaganda to, what, spreadsheet compliance.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And that friction, that conflict between valuing art for what it is and measuring it for what it does, is maybe most clearly illustrated by some European cultural policy models that explicitly try to resist market forces. You know, like Germany's Kulturpolitik or the French model.
The French model. It's fascinating because it's built on a concept specifically designed to defy those market pressures. It's called l'exception culturelle française.
The French cultural exception.
Right. And this concept is a deliberate philosophical act of resistance. It's a state-level declaration that cultural products are not just fungible commodities.
Which is an almost revolutionary idea in the context of globalized capitalism. They're basically saying that cultural products, films, books, music are fundamentally different from, say, cars or soybeans.
Exactly. And therefore, they cannot be subjected to the standard rules of free enterprise or pure sales criteria or the hegemony of the global market.
And what's their justification for that?
Their justification is profoundly existential. They argue that if French cultural producers were just overwhelmed by foreign content, which, let's be honest, primarily means American content.
Right.
If their writers, their filmmakers, their musicians were all sidelined, then France would no longer be France.
So cultural production becomes an issue of national identity, of sovereignty.
Yes, which in their view legitimizes deep state intervention and subsidy.
And they really put their money where their mouth is. There are serious teeth behind this idea. It's not just a philosophical stance.
Well, at all. This commitment informs their actions on the global stage, starting with, housing the UNESCO headquarters in Paris. But the policies themselves are very specific and far-reaching.
Like with television quotas.
Consider the EU's 1988 Television Without Frontiers Directive. While this applied across the whole EU, France was its main champion. They pushed for rules that mandate TV programs must include at least 50% European productions.
And France itself goes even further.
Yeah, internally, France often raises that quota to 60%.
That is a massive protective shield for European content creators. It guarantees exposure, it guarantees infrastructure funding, and you can see this commitment play out in these huge global trade wars. I'm thinking of the 1993 Uruguay round of GAMAT negotiations, the precursor to the WTO.
A pivotal moment. The French negotiators fiercely opposed the U.S. position on cultural goods.
And they won, right?
They succeeded in excluding cultural and audiovisual sectors from the final trade agreements. It was this huge statement arguing that culture is non-negotiable and it sits outside the realm of normal commercial goods exchange. They prioritize their cultural sovereignty over free trade.
And they also use financial incentives. The value-added tax, the TVA on cinema tickets, it's incredibly low.
It's 5.5%. And that 5.5% is crucial. It signals that cinema is not a luxury or just some entertainment. It's an essential good, like food or basic necessities, which also typically get that low rate.
As opposed to the standard rate.
The standard rate is 20% for most other consumer goods and services. So that difference significantly reduces the cost for consumers. And, it makes film production much more viable.
But I think the most astonishing example of the state prioritizing collective cultural life over private convenience is that regulation about TV schedules.
It's incredible. French law explicitly forbids free-to-air TV channels from showing a major feature film on a Saturday evening.
Which seems so counterintuitive from a business perspective.
From a business perspective, yes. But the policy is designed to suppress the temptation to just stay home and watch a movie. It's meant to encourage people to go out and participate in the shared cultural experience of the cinema. It frames culture as a necessary civic engagement, not just another consumer choice.
Okay, this is why I have to push back a little. If they have such a comprehensive system-heavy subsidies, quotas, protectionist taxes, all these regulations to protect art's intrinsic sovereign value, why does this modern pressure for utility that we're talking about still exist there? Are you saying this whole Kulturpolitik model is failing to protect artists from the bureaucracy?
That's an excellent challenge. And the answer is complex. The system is highly successful at protecting the infrastructure of national culture, The institutions, the industries, the language itself.
But not the individual artist.
Exactly. It doesn't insulate the individual practitioner from the modern accountability environment.
How does that work? How do those two things exist at the same time?
Well, even if the government is primarily funding culture for this high-minded goal of national identity, the intrinsic value, the current bureaucratic framework still demands measurable results.
Yep.
The grant committee has to justify its budget to the Treasury, and the Treasury speaks the language of social engineering and economic impact. So even in Berlin or Paris, the individual artist who's applying for a project grant is still pressured to show how their work achieves social cohesion or intercultural dialogue or community wellness, even if the art is purely existential or just aesthetically driven.
So the conflict happens right at that intersection. The high-level philosophical policy says, art is essential to the nation, but the application form says, prove your art has a 3-year measurable impact on youth literacy.
That's exactly right. The artist has to perform utility to survive. And that brings us to the global phenomenon that results from all this pressure, impact washing.
Impact washing. This is the critical mechanism we need to unpack here. It's that required performance, the overstating or, misrepresenting of a project's social effects, or just learning to frame existing difficult work in the safe, high jargon language of policy.
It's really a defensive strategy. The artist isn't necessarily being fraudulent, but the system forces them to wear a kind of bureaucratic uniform just to secure resources.
And the art itself can remain exactly the same. The integrity of the creative output isn't compromised.
Not at all. But the narrative that supports it, the justification on paper, transforms entirely to match whatever the policy agenda of the day is.
And this performance, it's strictly dictated by these standardized criteria that funders use to measure social impact. And you see this repeated across international granting bodies. To supposedly avoid actual impact washing, they enforce 3 main criteria: intentionality, additionality, and measurability.
We should definitely spend some time on these because they are the gatekeepers. So intentionality. This demands that the artistic project must have an explicit willingness from the very beginning to incorporate a solution to a community problem right into its core mission. It can't be an accident.
So it's not enough if, say, a museum exhibit just happens to generate some positive community engagement.
No, that's not enough. The museum has to prove that from the design stage, it was willing to sacrifice some of its purely aesthetic or even economic goals in favor of achieving that specific social result. If it's just a beneficial byproduct, it doesn't count.
Okay, what about the next one, additionality?
This is arguably the most difficult hurdle for an artist. Additionality requires you to prove that the intended impact would not have occurred without this one specific intervention or investment.
Now that just sounds impossible. How does an artist staging a challenging work prove additionality? How do you prove that a piece of performance art, for instance, fixed a specific instance of urban loneliness that the government or the market wouldn't have eventually addressed anyway?
That's the impossible task. It means the artistic organization has to be acting in fields where market mechanisms have failed, or they only partially work. If the grant committee thinks the social problem might solve itself or be addressed by a different nonprofit, then the artistic intervention is deemed not additional, and funding is often denied.
It forces this bizarre zero-sum mentality where art has to fight to prove its unique necessity.
It really does. And then finally, there's measurability. And that's the driver of the spreadsheet culture. It requires the organization to be accountable for the proposed social solution in quantifiable and/or qualitative terms, which generates this endless demand for metrics and data collection.
And when you take those 3 criteria together, they set a standard that highly unconventional, difficult, or purely philosophical art projects just cannot meet. Not without engaging in significant narrative restructuring.
In other words, impact washing.
We have to look at the human cost of this. I'm thinking back to that anecdote of Elias, the theater director in Berlin. He's proposing a silent, bleak, avant-garde play, maybe 30 minutes of pure, non-narrative existential isolation, just focusing on lighting and space. It's difficult work meant to provoke internal, individual reflection.
That kind of art is inherently non-instrumental in the policy sense. It completely defies easy definition or utility.
But Elias needs funding. He needs to pay his rent, his actors. He knows he can't submit an application that simply says, I am staging a beautiful and silent exploration of human despair.
Absolutely not. So he keeps the play exactly as it is. The artistic integrity of the work remains completely untouched.
But he engages in this spectacular piece of performance utility on paper.
The grant proposal is rewritten. The silent play is rebranded as a study in nonverbal communication strategies in a post-migrant society.
Wow.
The darkness and the void on stage become a visual exploration of shared urban anxiety and resilience. He just stuffs the application with all the right policy keywords, intercultural dialogue, social inclusion metrics, you name it.
And the grant committee, who are probably eager to check their own boxes for socially relevant art and meet their quotas for supporting projects in diverse communities, they approve the funding immediately.
Of course they do. And Elias gets the money. And the performance remains a man sitting alone in a chair for an hour.
The irony is just staggering. The committee likely believes they're funding some cutting-edge social experiment when, in reality, they've funded a deep, purely aesthetic contemplation.
The system is completely complicit in this narrative fraud because it prioritizes fluent jargon over genuine artistic intent or, frankly, any real community connection.
And this absurdity isn't just limited to avant-garde theater. It affects major institutions that rely on corporate or government funding. It forces curators into these really painful compromises, like the example of Sarah, the curator at a major contemporary art museum in London.
Sarah wanted to showcase this raw, powerful photography, documenting the ugly side of British industrial decline. Rusting machinery, closed factories, images that evoke anger and economic despair.
Yeah.
The difficult truths of a post-industrial society.
A deeply valuable but inherently uncomfortable body of work.
Exactly. However, the museum had just secured a major sponsorship deal with a large multinational health insurance company, and that company's marketing mandate revolved entirely around mental health and positivity. The photographs of rust and decay, of economic collapse and the resulting community anger, they just did not fit the wellness metric spreadsheet. So Sarah was faced with a stark choice: cancel the show or commit to impact washing.
And she chose survival.
She did. The exhibition goes ahead, but the official narrative transforms completely. The photos of economic collapse are officially reframed as a celebration of resilience and community fortitude.
All the references to anger or despair are scrubbed from the press release.
And this leads to the ultimate farce. The sponsors demand demonstrable wellness outcomes. So the museum is forced to install a mindfulness corner.
You're kidding.
Complete with bean bags and maybe some essential oil diffusers, right next to a raw, powerful photo of a burning car or a crumbling factory wall.
That intersection of genuine artistic expression and forced wellness marketing, it just epitomizes the danger here. This forced utility strips art of its right to be difficult, to be challenging, to be negative. Art loses its critical edge.
It does. If you only fund art that promotes positivity, resilience, and these measurable social fixes, you eliminate the very work that forces society to confront injustice, to acknowledge failure, or to feel collective grief, the art that necessitates fundamental change.
So art is just reduced to what is immediately justifiable. It ends up just mirroring society's demands rather than challenging or shaping them. It becomes compliance over content.
Precisely. And this leads us directly to the systemic bias that results from all this bureaucratic gatekeeping. Because the fluency in policy speak, the ability to write like Elias and Sarah were forced to, becomes a key form of sociocultural capital.
Absolutely. The system rewards those with the right networks, the specific credentials, and the comfort level with policy jargon, the people who can fluidly talk about theory of change, logic models, and longitudinal impact studies.
It creates this self-reinforcing loop. The system rewards performance and compliance over genuine, deeply rooted community work.
And the data, it confirms that this compliance mechanism disproportionately reinforces existing racial inequities in arts funding, particularly in the U.S.
The statistics are truly stark. And frankly, they're shameful. A 2017 study reaffirmed findings from 2011, and it demonstrated that despite all the increased public discussion about equity in the cultural sector, the racial inequity in arts funding has actually persisted, and in some metrics, it's even increased over a decade.
Let's really dissect the numbers to understand the magnitude of the skew. We're talking about something called the 602 rule.
The 602 rule. 60% of all arts funding goes to just 2% of cultural institutions.
60% to 2%.
And that 2% predominantly represents large, established institutions, your major symphony orchestras, opera houses, big museums, that overwhelmingly present white and Western European art forms. This concentration of capital makes it nearly impossible for smaller, mission-driven organizations to compete for resources or influence.
And the other side of that coin is just as grim. Organizations that are specifically serving communities of color receive only 4% of arts funding.
Just think about that proportion for a second. Only 4% of the funding base, despite the fact that people of color comprise 38% of the U.S. population. And what's more, in many big cities, the organizations serving communities of color make up 25 to 30% of all the existing arts organizations.
So the system is just funneling the vast majority of resources toward preserving a dominant, historically privileged cultural narrative.
It is. And this overwhelming disparity means that the vital, necessary work that's happening at the grassroots level, particularly in historically significant and diverse cities like Oakland, California, faces these impossible structural obstacles.
Oakland is such a powerful case study for this. It's incredibly diverse and has this foundational history of social activism, being the birthplace of the Black Panther Party. Its cultural ecosystem is deeply rooted in using art for social justice and community building.
The small mission-driven groups in Oakland, the ones operating with budgets often under $250,000, they form an essential, independent ecosystem. They don't just put on plays. Their missions are anchored directly in local social justice concerns.
But they are systematically denied adequate resources because of those structural obstacles you mentioned.
First, the lack of staff capacity for intensive fundraising is huge. Large institutions have dedicated development teams. A grassroots collective might have one overworked person who also manages the programming and, sweeps the floor at night.
And crucially, many of them aren't structured as formal 501c3 nonprofit entities.
Right. They operate as artist collectives or unincorporated social enterprises, or even ritual gatherings forms of community organization that often disqualify them from traditional foundation grants, which are legally mandated to only fund formal nonprofits.
Their very existence is also physically threatened by the same forces art is often asked to fix. Gentrification and displacement disproportionately impact these grassroots spaces.
The data from Oakland is shocking. 91% of the mapped arts organizations there are located in areas that are experiencing accelerating rates of low-income household displacement. They are fighting for survival on multiple fronts: financial, structural, and physical.
And yet, their impact is incredibly cross-sectoral. They're functioning as a kind of localized social safety net. They're using arts and culture to address these critical non-art issues: food deserts, housing, healthcare access, economic development, education.
They're delivering the very measurable social utility that funders claim they want. But the funders fail to invest at a level that reflects this broad systemic role they play. The recommendations coming out of these studies are clear. We need explicit racial equity funding and cross-sector funding that recognizes their integrated function, moving away from siloed arts-only funding.
It would require a fundamental shift, a shift away from rewarding bureaucratic reporting and toward trusting community input, recognizing local knowledge as a legitimate form of capital.
Otherwise, the system guarantees that the organizations best equipped to write the grant applications, not the ones doing the most meaningful work, will continue to secure the resources.
And this dynamic, it plays out globally, often reinforcing deep socioeconomic inequalities between the global north and the global south. The case of Amara versus Julian in Nairobi is a heartbreaking illustration of how this bureaucratic barrier just perpetuates inequity.
So Amara is the grassroots artist. She runs a local collective teaching children in the Nairobi slums to paint murals. Her work is sustained, it's genuine, and it keeps kids engaged and off the streets. It's real, visible impact on human lives.
But then a major global north cultural fund opens its grant cycle.
And Amara hits the policy barrier. The application demands this sophisticated policy analysis, a detailed theory of change, plans for longitudinal impact studies, and explicit alignment with multiple UN Sustainable Development Goals. Amara is an artist and a community organizer. She's not a policy analyst. She simply can't afford the time or the consultants required to navigate that system.
Meanwhile, you have Julian. He's just returned to Nairobi with a Western master's degree in arts management.
And he has the language. He might have minimal organic connection to the neighborhood, but he can write a dazzling proposal filled with the exact buzzwords the funding body wants to hear. All this talk of creative sector growth and digital platforms.
And Julian gets the money.
Of course he does. The grant system prioritizes the best paperwork over the best work. And the result is a classic superficial intervention. Julian stages a 3-day digital workshop, which looks great in the final report, but it requires electricity and devices the community rarely has access to.
He takes the necessary photos showing engaged children for the obligatory impact report, publishes his findings aligning with SDG 4, and then he moves on.
The intervention is fleeting, designed for compliance. And Amara, who is still present and rooted in the community, is left buying paint with her own personal money, doing the slow, difficult, sustained work that actually creates durable social outcomes.
This cycle is just so destructive. It claims to be aiding the marginalized, but it effectively reinforces a system where Only those fluent in the elite bureaucratic language, often those with Western training or socioeconomic privilege, can access the resources.
It reinforces a kind of colonial-era dependency on Western-style management expertise and pushes genuine grassroots culture further and further to the periphery.
So the system is structurally mandated to prioritize compliance and bureaucratic language over deep community connection. And this demand for quantifiable impact has only accelerated, right? Driven by the rapid digitalization sweeping through the cultural sector.
Absolutely. The digital transformation, which was dramatically accelerated by the shock of the COVID-19 pandemic, has forced cultural institutions, which, as a sector, are often conservative and slow to change, to fundamentally rethink their entire practice. Innovation and technology transfer are no longer optional. They become components of survival.
And this isn't just an organic change. It's a direct policy mandate linked to massive investment. National and supranational measures. I'm thinking of the Italian PNRR, the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, which is funded through the Next Generation EU guidelines. They are explicitly linking cultural investment with digitalization and social inclusion.
These huge funding streams require cultural entities to integrate technology not just for preservation, but for demonstrating positive social impact. Since culture is recognized as this essential pillar of society, preserving both material and immaterial heritage, any open innovation or tech transfer has to prove measurable social value.
This mandate creates an urgent need for robust measurement models, like the one developed by research institutions such as the Politecnico di Milano. The models have to be capable of demonstrating the worth of technology and innovation processes, specifically to avoid two major risks: mission drift and, again, impact washing.
Mission drift is a constant danger for these hybrid organizations that are trying to balance a social mission with the need for profitability. In digital projects, if the measurement isn't structured correctly, the technology itself can become the objective rather than just the means to reach the social aim.
The shiny new toy becomes the point.
Exactly. The pursuit of the technological novelty can completely eclipse the social reason for the project in the first place.
So these innovation frameworks, they have to adhere to several crucial pillars to maintain focus. The first one is anchoring measurement in something called the social value chain.
Right, the social value chain. This requires a careful distinction between different time horizons of effect. So you have the immediate input funding, staff time, equipment, which lead to outputs.
And outputs are the direct products or services created. So 10 digital workshops, a new online archive.
Correct. Then you move to outcomes, the medium-term effects on the beneficiaries. This is where you see changes like 50 attendees acquired basic digital literacy skills, or local engagement rates increased by 15%.
And finally, you get to the long-term impacts.
Right, the changes on the entire community or society. This is the big goal, like reduce unemployment due to increased digital competence or strengthen collective identity. Any good measurement has to cover this entire, often multi-year chain.
The framework also has to seriously consider the local reference context. This seems especially vital in heterogeneous areas like Italy, where the social and economic landscapes can vary so dramatically between, say, Milan and a small, marginalized village in the south.
100%. A technological solution that creates value in a high-connectivity urban center could easily become a source of marginalization in a region with low digital literacy or poor infrastructure. So the measurement has to be flexible enough to assess relevance and impact based on the unique local reality.
And the final pillar is multidimensionality. Impact can't be simplified or flattened.
Exactly. It has to be broken down into specific areas to capture the complexity of culture. The advanced frameworks break it down into 4 distinct areas: economic, cultural, societal, and environmental.
And technology is transversal to all 4.
Right. An innovative project might reduce its carbon footprint, that's environmental, create new jobs, economic, foster stronger community bonds, societal, and digitize rare historical manuscripts, cultural. The real challenge is finding metrics that can accurately weigh these non-economic dimensions.
Because technology itself is amoral, isn't it? It's not intrinsically good or bad. It entirely depends on how it's employed.
Precisely. To ensure the implementation results in tech for good, in genuine value creation, the entire process has to be structured, collaborative, human-centered, and ethical. If it's poorly implemented, digital tools just become another source of exclusion. And we have plenty of evidence of this, even in developed European nations.
Like the risk of digital illiteracy. If you migrate cultural services online to meet a policy goal, but for instance, 3 million families in Italy can't access the necessary technological infrastructures, you haven't democratized culture.
You've simply reinforced marginalization.
So the measurement challenge, even with these robust frameworks, remains immense.
It does. Two major issues constantly emerge. First, there's the problem of subjectivity and intangibles.
The cultural sector is highly relational. How do you quantify the feeling of awe when you're standing in front of a masterpiece? How do you convert perceptions, feelings, relational goods, or a sense of shared identity into reliable quantitative metrics?
It's often impossible, which forces a reliance on proxy metrics like visitor numbers or duration of engagement, which completely miss the core aesthetic or emotional value.
And the second major challenge is the inherent conflict in the time horizon.
Yes, social impact is not a quick fix. It requires long-term engagement and assessment, 5, 10, 20 years, to be considered durable and real.
Yet, technology changes at lightning speed. Funders demand rapid results, and innovation cycles are incredibly short.
So how do you reconcile the slow, generational pace of social impact with the fast-changing complexity of technology? The two timescales are fundamentally incompatible.
Even successful projects face this. I know the Innova Muse project in Lombardy, Italy, tested this framework, and it showed that a structured innovation process involving cultural institutions and startups could effectively map outcomes like the acquisition of managerial and innovation skills.
But the measurement limitations, the subjectivity, the time lag, they remained intractable structural challenges. So while we are developing more sophisticated tools to measure impact, the fact remains that the most meaningful cultural outcomes will always resist quantification.
And this pressure to quantify everything has led some artists to stop trying to play the game altogether. Instead, they use their practice to actively critique the very systems of money and access that underpin the art world itself. They're turning the lens back onto the economic infrastructure.
Aaron Flint Jameson is a compelling figure here. His work doesn't just critique policy in a vague way. It names specific financial mechanisms. For instance, his work's titled Opportunity Zones.
That title is a direct reference to a very specific piece of U.S. political policy, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This scheme was a tax incentive program designed to encourage speculative, long-term investment in low-income, economically distressed areas.
The mechanism is crucial to understand. Investors who put capital into these certified opportunity funds can defer or even eliminate their capital gains taxes. So the policy links speculative investment strategies, political policy, and the geography of poverty directly to the art world simply by being titled and exhibited.
And the scheme encouraged external investment. An investor doesn't need to live in the zone they're investing in or even hold U.S. citizenship. It was about leveraging tax incentives to encourage speculation in property markets that were previously deemed too risky, which often just accelerated gentrification without benefiting the existing residents.
And Jameson uses this profound metaphor in this work. Zinc hardware used as sacrificial anodes. We need to understand what a sacrificial anode is to get the critique.
A sacrificial anode is a more electrochemically active metal like zinc, magnesium, or aluminum that's attached to a less active material like steel or copper to prevent corrosion.
And the key is the sacrifice. The anode is consumed. It literally corrodes and dissolves away, so that the primary, more valuable material is protected from erosion. The anode is the designated victim, ensuring the stability of the main structure.
Jameson extends this metaphor to the artwork itself, and maybe even to the artist. The artwork, acting as the sacrificial anode, is consumed intellectually, financially, aesthetically, in place of the primary material, which is the underlying financial system, or the art market infrastructure.
The artwork's meaning is sacrificed to ensure the smooth operation and preservation of the very market it critiques. It suggests a necessary complicity, a designated sacrifice that's required for the whole, often morally dubious system to function without catastrophic erosion.
And this critique expands beyond just public policy. It focuses on that opaque, globalized financial layer of the art world that exists parallel to public institutions, the system of free ports and specialized storage facilities.
Free ports. These highly secretive, high-security storage facilities, like Arcis in New York or the vast complexes in Geneva, Luxembourg, and Dubai, they are spaces of terminal impermanence where high-value assets, including fine art, can be stored in transit, tax-free, often for years or even decades.
They function as specialized vaults for the global wealthy. Because the art is technically in transit, it's never officially entered the national jurisdiction, it avoids import duties, customs fees, and sales taxes.
Which is critical for art that's being treated purely as a financial asset, not a cultural one. It allows these assets to be bought and sold repeatedly without ever physically moving, sometimes without the owner even holding citizenship in the country where the Freeport is located. They are spaces of pure speculation, and they raise serious security concerns about smuggling, money laundering, and tax evasion.
So the system's defining operation, then, is obfuscation. It thrives on secrecy, on the idea that value is best preserved when it remains hidden from public scrutiny or even from tax authorities.
And Jameson mimics this obfuscation. He creates what's been called the black box aesthetic. In one exhibition, he mounted a high-tech, Faro-focused 3D scanner on a tripod, and it just converted the gallery space, the concrete inhabitable space, into raw data files, into abstract inputs and outputs.
But he withheld any explanation for the viewer. So you, the viewer, witness this complex technical process of conversion, the space turning into abstract data, but you're denied the insider knowledge of why it's happening or what the data is being used for.
This emphasizes that structural divide between those who possess the intellectual capital or the inside knowledge required to understand the mechanism and the general audience who are left outside. His use of sealed or custom materials just reinforces his black box nature.
And this all leads us to this fundamental crisis of purpose that stems from the legacy of conceptual art. If the artwork successfully critiques the system of power, value, and access, but that very critique is immediately absorbed, rewarded, and sold by the system, is the critique even effective?
The art world rewards that intellectual capital and fluency in conceptual critique. The knowledge surrounding Jameson's work understanding, opportunity zones, sacrificial anodes, and freeports, that knowledge itself becomes a valuable commodity.
So the desire surrounding contemporary art becomes about gaining that insider knowledge, about hoarding that intellectual capital that ushers you into the hall of connoisseurs, proving you understand the system's complicity. The art market rewards the performance of knowing, just as the grant system rewards the performance of utility.
It's all about privileged access, whether that's access to tax havens or access to esoteric intellectual concepts.
Ultimately, this brings us full circle. The problem isn't that art is instrumental. The grand patrons, the Medici, the popes, they prove it always has been a tool.
The modern crisis is that the instrumentalization has become small, dishonest, and performative. It demands that cultural products prioritize bureaucratic compliance, quantifiable fixes, and the language of policy over any intrinsic meaning, depth, or difficulty. It forces art to justify itself by delivering measurable social outcomes as quickly as possible.
The argument we really need to hold on to is so much broader and more foundational than any grant application can capture. It's the argument that culture matters because it is what makes us fundamentally human.
Art shouldn't be viewed as some disposable tool or a luxury item that we use to fix other problems. It is essential, like oxygen.
It's not about art fixing the problems dictated by the political agenda of the moment or solving the immediate checklist of a funder. It's about art being the very thing that expands our capacity for empathy, for critique, for self-reflection. It makes us capable of recognizing what problems are even worth solving in the first place.
The challenge remains shifting our systems of valuation and funding past the exhaustion of impact reports and policy alignment. We must find ways to recognize and fund art's fundamental, unquantifiable value to society, the value that transcends the spreadsheet, the quota, and the black box of global finance.